Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. I'm Sally Whipple. I'm the executive director here, and we are very happy to have you here for this afternoon's conversation at noon. Every month we explore the people, places, issues, and ideas of Connecticut, past and present. We've done a lot of programs about Connecticut heroes and legends, about leaders and citizens who have really worked hard to change Connecticut and make it better. We have never done a program about jerks. And so this is the first time we've done that. So we're really glad that you're here. And I think this should be very interesting. So I would like to start out and get right into the program by introducing Diane Smith, who's going to start off the program and moderate what I know is going to be a fascinating discussion about Connecticut jerks. Diane is Connecticut Network's senior producer for program development. She has been honored as a journalist, an author, and a video producer, and she has been honored as an unofficial but very effective ambassador for the state of Connecticut. We're very lucky to have her in Connecticut. She is not a Connecticut jerk at all. But she does a lot for Connecticut. She does a lot for us, and we're really happy that you're here to watch her in action as we talk about an important part of Connecticut. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, as Sally said, here at the Old State House, we generally highlight the heroes of Connecticut history. But this month, we thought just for a change of pace in the heat of the summer, it was time to shine the spotlight on a rogues gallery of incorrigible nutmegger ne'er-do-wells. Our guest today is Ray Bendici, whose recent book is titled Speaking Ill of the Dead, Jerks in Connecticut History. As soon as I heard that book was coming out, I thought, we have to get Ray to come and talk about this. In the next hour, we're going to take a look at some of the most notorious bad guys, perpetrators of mischief, and other colorful anti-heroes from the Constitution State. From nefarious murderers to ruthless industrialists, Ray writes about 15 jerks Connecticut has survived, including Lydia Sherman, the Black Widow who murdered 3 husbands, George Metesky, the Mad Bomber, and of course Benedict Arnold, who not only betrayed his country but who really ticked off a lot of people in New London when he burned it to the ground. So, Ray, a little bit of background. He is a longtime editor at Connecticut Magazine. He has covered the state in depth on a variety of subjects. He also runs a fabulous website called damnedct.com, which is dedicated to everything that's odd, unexplained, or weird in this state, and there's plenty of it. In addition to Speaking Ill of the Dead, Jerks in Connecticut History, he co-wrote Connecticut Curiosities, the 3rd edition. He can also be found writing regularly at raybendici.com. But on to our topic today, death, betrayal, mayhem, and murder. And as Ray assures us, all of it really happened.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out. I appreciate it and braving the heat. And I'd also like to thank the Old State House and everyone else for having me. Unlike Diane, I have to go on the record and saying I am a jerk. I'm pretty straightforward about it. I embrace that. It's okay. My sisters can tell you plenty of stories, and there are others. But and seriously, someone that goes out and writes about a bunch of dead people who can't defend themselves, let's be real, that's kind of jerky. But that's okay. I'm good with it. I think we all are. I think... we all kind of, like, I assume because you're all here, you all enjoy jerks to some level yourself. As I like to say, with the show Cops, no one really tunes in to see the cops. They kind of tune in to see the sideshow. So hopefully that's some of why you're here. I just want to talk real quickly how I got the assignment. As Diane mentioned, I did Connecticut Curiosities for Globe Pequot Press, and apparently something I did in that process that when they had this idea for jerks, they said, I'm the man. So I don't know how that happened, but that's fine. I kind of stretched the definition of jerk a little to have some fun with it. I thought, rather than just list boring murderer after murderer, that's all right. But I kind of wanted to, make it entertaining. I really tried to work on that with this book, where the stories, some of the people were jerks through and through. Some of them, their jerkiness can be debated a little, and then others were jerks for a little while and then redeemed themselves. So try to give a mix and. Rather than, like I said, there are murderers in there, but there's also, as I mentioned, there's industrialists, there's a colorful counterfeiter, there is a North American sachem, an accused witch, a vindictive minister, an iconic showman, a transplanted Russian count, a wise guy mobster, a corporate con man, And as she mentioned, the nation's most infamous traitor, Benedict Arnold, and also God, or a guy who said first he was a prophet, and then he decided that he was the son of God, and he referred to himself as the sinning Jesus. That was Brother Julius Shacknow. One of the other, when we do the panel discussion, Charlie Monagan, my longtime cohort at Connecticut Magazine, will talk a little more about Brother Julius, as he actually interviewed Brother Julius firsthand and can probably tell you a lot more about him than I even wrote. We'll get to that later. Also, the title I always feel might be a little bit of a misnomer, Speaking Ill of the Dead, because as far as I know, 14 of the 15 people in the book are dead. The 15th one is, I wrote about it, one of the gentlemen in the book called, his name is Salvatore Nunziato, also known as Midge Renault. He's a mobster from West Haven. And in classic mafia style, one night he went out for a ride and never came back. They never found his body. This was like in 1979. They did find some bodies in Hamden a couple of years later under a garage that they thought one of them might be him, but his living relatives didn't want anything to do with it, wouldn't give any DNA, and so Midge might still be out there somewhere, and if he's in this book, I don't know that, well, first of all, I'm not sure that he could read it, and second of all, he was one of those jerks. I think he's very proud of who he was and would kind of embrace that and enjoy knowing that he was in a book. But I did the math on it. He's 93, so I mean, if he comes to confront me, I'm not too worried about it. But I don't expect him to be back. So I wasn't sure when this assignment or the book came up how it was going to be received. Speaking of the Dead doesn't always go over well, although I'm glad you're all here. And then when I started getting contacted by some bookstores to do some book signings, I also reached out to some bookstores, and I was told by one in one Fairfield County town, which I won't name, New Canaan, that they said I would not be a good fit for their store or for their atmosphere or whatever. So I'm glad you guys feel like I was a good fit and you came out for this. I do appreciate that. I also got a fan letter, which I was kind of excited about at first. It was postmarked from South Carolina, and I noticed as looking at it closer, it was from a correctional facility. So the person writing it was a former Connecticut resident, and he had told me that he had seen a blurb about the forthcoming book in Connecticut Magazine, which he had a subscription to. So apparently he has a lot of time to read. And, he was interested in could I get a copy sent to him, and he was very excited about it. And I was like, okay. So I sent it, but of course, immediately after I read the letter, like anyone else, I went to the internet and tried to figure out exactly why he was being held, as he put it, in the Redneck Republic of South Carolina. Those are his words, not mine. So I went to the internet and went and found out, and apparently he was there because after he was done murdering his mother, he cut her into a bunch of small pieces so she could fit in suitcases, and then he could take her out to the neighborhood and bury her in different places. So the good news, Midge, when he gets out, this gentleman will be in his 80s or 90s. So if they want to get together and come visit me, I suppose that's something. The thing that always interests me at that gentleman's letter, at the end of it, he wrote, he signed it fraternally yours. So I guess he figures we're all in the same group, So kind of excited about that, and can't say he's necessarily wrong. I thought, rather than, I know some speakers like to read straight from their books, and I'm not going to do that because I already read it. No. I thought it might be fun to kind of use some stuff that were outtakes, things, like the bonus materials, if this was a DVD, things that didn't necessarily make it into the book, but I thought were kind of interesting and fun and that you all might enjoy. I'd like to start out, there's the book cover there, and you can see on the cover Benedict Arnold. A lot of people don't realize that he was born in Norwich and then eventually moved to New Haven, set up shop there, and was actually quite a successful businessman. But all the things that made him a successful businessman and then later kind of a successful soldier also made him a successful jerk. Again, had a short fuse. He got in fights. He often challenged people to duels. But on top of that, he was actually a brilliant and very brave general. That's one of the reasons why his betrayal was so so heart-wrenching to Washington at the time when it happened. I mean, we all know the general story of, how he tried to turn over the plans to West Point over to the British. But that happened after a series of events, which I detail in the book. But as I said earlier, a lot of people don't realize what a terrific general he was, how brave he was. He was not someone to sit back and watch a fight while it was going on. He was very instrumental in the Battle of Saratoga in particular, which, if you know your American history or not, was kind of one of the key battles in the Revolutionary War. And when the Americans won it, it kind of brought the French in on the American side and kind of helped lead eventually to ultimate victory. But Arnold, during that battle, had gotten in a fight with the commanding officer beforehand, General Gates, and he had kind of been relegated to kind of sitting or benched or given a timeout or whatever you want to call it. Kind of had told to sit in his tent. He wasn't allowed to fight, and eventually, as the battle was kind of raging on and the Americans were not faring well, he's kind of watching, and he was watching, and he was watching, apparently drinking also. And at some point, he just couldn't take it anymore, gets up, jumps up on his horse, grabs his sword, and literally screams, "Any brave man, follow me," into battle, and rides into battle against the British and leads this amazing charge that turns the battle and helps the American. I hope I didn't give spoilers, right? Helps turn the tide for the Americans. And literally, he was a man of action. He fought in a couple of battles like that where he mixed it up. And some people might know about the Battle of Saratoga. His name was actually struck from like the battlefield. It's kind of erased from all the memorials there. If you go there, the only thing you'll find is a boot, and that's to honor some general. And they don't mention, but it's Benedict Arnold. And if he hadn't been such a jerk and turned down, later on, there would probably be towns called Arnoldsburg or Benedictsville or places like that around America. I mean, he really was that big a hero at the time. And again, that's what made his fall so tragic at the end. One stop along the way, another kind of role that he had was during the Battle of Ridgefield, which was in May 1777. And I found a little clipping from the Connecticut Journal, which was printed a couple of days after the battle. And I just thought I'd read this. It talks about General Arnold had taken post with about 200 men. The rest of our small body were posted on the flanks, who all acted with great spirit. The general had his horse shot out from under him, and when the enemy were within about 10 yards of him, he recovered himself, drew his pistol, and shot a soldier who was advancing on him with his bayonet. So, Benedict Arnold, he mixed it up. He was kind of a badass, but ultimately a jerk, as you'll find out. Another person from the cover of the book, which, if you're looking at in a moment, is George Metesky, who is the Mad Bomber of, there he is, looking kind of happy there in jail. The Mad Bomber of New York from Waterbury. As I mentioned, Charlie recently wrote a musical about him called Mad Bomber, which was staged at Waterbury's Seven Angels Theater and is now actually being workshopped in Los Angeles. Charlie? Yes. So hopefully maybe to off-Broadway somewhere. But he's an interesting character. I'm not going to steal all thunder here, but there was one thing that I loved about this guy. He was kind of your original... Well, he was a mad genius, kind of. He was mad, like mad angry, but also mad like a genius. And there was one part from his interrogation that I thought was fun that I had read. It was compiled by this gentleman named Michael Greenberg, who wrote this book called The Mad Bomber of New York, which is a great, wonderfully detailed book about his whole story. And this was from the interrogation, which I thought was interesting, when the police were trying to figure out what he was using to make bombs. And they asked him, "What was the means you used to explode the bomb at Grand Central Station?" And Metesky answered, "It was a wafer." And they were like, "What do you mean, a wafer?" And his response was, "The wafer was a Parke Davis throat disc, which would be affected by the moisture in the bomb housing. I put about 3 drops of water on it." And the police were stunned. Basically, he was using a throat lozenge to set off his bombs, which is kind of, to me, it was kind of amazing. Like, give you an idea of what type of genius he was, but a mad genius. And he also had a lot of other issues, which I'm sure we'll get into later. I should pause for a moment. I also want to. I just mentioned a moment ago the Mad Bomber of New York. If you pick up my book and you read through. I obviously did thumbnail sketches of the people in there. Only a couple thousand words about each. There are some terrific books, and I mentioned them at the beginning, that I would recommend if you want to do further reading. And one of the other panelists here, and William Phelps, wrote two of the books. One about Amy Archer Gilligan, which is The Devil's Boarding House. Rooming House. Rooming. I always get it right. I'm always like, it's always the wrong one. The Devil's Rooming House, and also The Devil's Left Hand, right? Right hand. See how I do with that. And that's about Sam Colt. I am a jerk. I can't even get that right. At least I'm mentioning it. So, and there are a couple of other really good source material I highly recommend. If you enjoy any of this, pick it up. And a lot of people did a lot more work than I did, kind of detailing the stories. One of the people that wrote a lot about himself was P.T. Barnum, and this is someone we all know, a person who I like to say that he really embraced his jerkiness. He didn't care. I mean, he did. He was a showman through and through. And I don't know if he ever actually said, I don't care what they say about me, just make sure they spell my name right. But that was generally his attitude. And we know a lot of the things that he did. His feeling was he could show any sort of hoax or whatever, as long as he felt people were being entertained in the end. Like, this famous story about the Fiji Mermaid, which was clearly a fake that he had made and tried to exhibit as a real mermaid, and people came through the door, paid money to see it, and then later when it came out that it wasn't, he was kind of surprised. That was also the other one, too. One of his first exhibits was this woman called, I forget her name, but she was supposed to be the nursemaid of George Washington, which would have made her about 160 years old at the time she was touring with Barnum. So Barnum was like, oh, that's what she tells me. So apparently when she died, she was only 80, and of course no one was more shocked than Barnum. He was like, I can't believe it. What? How could that be? So, but I kind of, doing my research for Barnum, I did find this one story from his autobiography, which I thought was kind of great. He was kind of give you a kind of insight into how he maybe got to be the type of person that he was. And he talked about his grandfather, who he loved dearly, and that he was named after. And his grandfather had promised him a great property named Ivy Island, and that when he got to 21 years old, he would take inheritance of this great property. And his whole family knew about Ivy Island. His mother even told him at one point, now, Taylor, don't become so excited when you see your property as to let your joy make you sick. For remember, rich as you are, that it will be 11 years before you can come into possession of your fortune. So everyone was kind of, he was very excited about getting this property. And then when he got to about 11 years old, his father was like, you know what, I think it's time you see your property. And he was really excited. So he was taken, his father had a neighbor named Edmund take an axe and announce to Barnum that it was time to go see your property. So I'm going to read this. This is his experience from his autobiography. Barnum says, "We started, and as we approached the north end of the meadow, we found the ground swampy and wet, and were soon obliged to leap from bog to bog on our route. A misstep brought me up to my middle in water, and to add to the dilemma, a swarm of hornets attacked me. Attaining the altitude of another bog, I was cheered by the assurance that there was only a quarter of a mile of this kind of travel to the edge of my property. I waded on. In about 15 minutes more, after floundering through the morass, I found myself half drowned, hornet stung, mud covered, and out of breath, but on comparatively dry land. 'Never mind, my boy,' said Edmund. 'We have only to cross this little creek, and you'll be upon your valuable property.' We were on the margin of a stream, the banks of which were thickly covered with alders. I now discovered the use of Edmund's axe, for he felled a small oak to form a temporary bridge to my island property. Crossing over, I proceeded to the center of my domain. I saw nothing but a few stunted ivies and straggling trees. The truth flashed upon me. I had been the laughingstock of the family in the neighborhood for years. My valuable Ivy Island was almost inaccessible, a worthless bit of barren land. And while I stood there deploring my sudden downfall, a huge black snake, one of my tenants, approached me with upraised head. I gave one shriek and rushed for the bridge. This was my first and last visit to Ivy Island. My father asked me how I liked my property, and I responded that I would sell it pretty cheap. So I kind of like I kind of appreciate that Barnum was even taken in on occasion after he took so many other people. I have another person in the book as I think Reverend Herbert Hayden. There he is. This is kind of an interesting case. This is one of the murderers in the book. There's 3, if you're counting. Not to ruin it, but and he murdered allegedly murdered the next door neighbor, a young girl who thought she was pregnant with Hayden's baby and told Hayden, and he thought the best way to kind of get rid of her was to kill her. He slashed her throat and poisoned her and left her in the woods to make it look like a suicide, because most people slash their own throats and leave themselves in the middle of the woods. They actually found his knife with her blood on it, but it was kind of before the age of forensic testing, so no one really, he was able to get out of it by basically fooling the jury. And one of the things he also did in fooling the jury, he was also tried to sweet talk his wife. He wrote his own autobiography, and he called it the Reverend Herbert Hiram Hayden Autobiography, The Mary Stannard Murder, tried on circumstantial evidence, which sounds a little like, I didn't do it, but if I did, this is how it was somebody else's book. But the cases are pretty remarkably parallel. But so you tell me, this is a description of his wife that he wrote in the book about, about the murder trial. And you tell me if this sounds like he may be compensating for something. The prosecution had examined 106 witnesses and the defense 70. In this array of witnesses, Mrs. Hayden stands a central figure. Her beauty, modest demeanor, and positive language place her on the highest pedestal. Clad in a close-fitting black dress that showed the symmetry of her form to perfection, she stood like a statue with uplifted hands while the oath was being administered. For 2 days she retained her remarkable self-possession and broke into tears only when Mr. Walters subjected her to the terrible ordeal that drew upon him the indignation of those whose sympathies are possibly untempered by the best of judgment. The appearance of Susan Hawley, the half-sister of the murdered girl, presented a marked contrast to that of Mrs. Hayden. Poor Susan's toilet was not in the best of taste. Her complexion was sallow, and her small gray eyes lacked the magnetism of the expressive brown orbs of the clergyman's wife. One was a cultivated woman, the other an untutored country girl. Susan burst into tears under the pressure of a courteous but persistent examination. Mrs. Hayden wept because Mr. Waller's pointed questions touched her to the soul. One wept from annoyance, the other from pain. Susan was vacillating and hesitating, and at times refused to answer annoying questions. Mrs. Hayden answered all questions promptly, fluently, and grammatically. So I assume he wrote all that because after his wife found out that he had murdered the neighbor girl, then he needed to... And he was acquitted, by the way. He wasn't acquitted. It was a hung trial because most of the people believed that he was too eloquent to have done it. And they believed his wife, and that's whose butt he kisses in this. So I'm getting the sense that you want to wrap it up a little. So can I just one more? And then I will cut off. I know I had Lydia Sherman. She's she's a Derby poisoner. I'm not going to go into too much detail about her in the book. I just want to talk about my favorite guy real quickly, who's the last one, whose name is William Stewart. And this is like my favorite and kind of a local a little bit. He wrote a book modestly called Sketches of the Life of William Stewart, the first and most celebrated counterfeiter of Connecticut, as given by himself. The original copy is available in the State Library right across here, and I actually went to get it, and at some point I thought about running off with it, which would have been a great jerky thing to do, but the guards I think Stewart would have appreciated it, but the guards would have frowned upon it and everything else. But there is a copy of it. They actually, someone made this series of older books, and they actually photocopied the pages. I just want to read you one thing. If 1/10 of the stuff he did in this book is true, then he's a terrific jerk. But I just want to read just real quickly one thing that he had done. Eventually, he's a counterfeiter. He has all these other adventures that are exciting. I want to make a screenplay out of it. It's fantastic. It's hard to believe that he did all these things. But eventually he gets caught for counterfeiting and gets sent to Old Newgate Prison, which is now Prison and Coppermine right over here. I'm pointing that way. I think it's that way to East. That way? East Granby? Thank you. That way. I don't live in Hartford, so I'm like, okay, that way. And he was in there for a couple of years. He led a revolt that failed miserably. But the reason I love this book is just the way he kind of writes about people and his kind of language and doing things like this. One of the things he got to do while he was there was he was able to make soap But also, he took silver from other prisoners, or pewter, and was able to make fake coins, continued to be counterfeiter in prison. And eventually he gets, one of the things to kind of speed up their jail time was that they were allowed to sell their wares to people that came by, unsuspecting people, and he kind of passed fake coins along there. At some point, someone who'd gotten ripped off by Stewart comes back and tells the warden that, and Captain Tuller is the warden and his arch nemesis, as it turns out, as the story goes. Tuller kind of comes back to the prison and says, the gentleman points him out, says, that's the guy who did it. And Tuller goes over to him and says, "Oh, you devil, are you making counterfeit money here?" "No," said I. "Have you got more in your pockets?" "No, sir," said I. "Let me feel." And Tuller puts his hand in his pocket and pulls out a bunch of coins. He goes, "What do you make me for?" And then I replied, "I was sent here for counterfeiting, and I shall lose my skill unless I do a little at the business." To which Tuller responds, "Stewart, I believe that you are the devil," and then turned to the visitor and said, "If you deal with these fellows, you must look out for yourself." So it was just kind of fun. And there's a lot of stories. If I had more time, I would recommend getting this. You can buy this version off Amazon and kind of read through, and there's just a ton of great stories. But I think we're going to kind of move on to the next phase of this, right? Pardon me?
Thank you, Ray.
Oh, thank you. So I hope that was okay.
Our panel discussion, and I would like to remind you while they're getting settled on stage that we do have books available on this side of the room, and as always in the summer on Tuesdays and Fridays, delicious fruits and vegetables outside at the farmers market. Diane, thank you.
Joining me now for this panel discussion, and by the way, you're welcome to ask questions if you like. If you do want to ask a question, raise your hand and we'll have someone come to you with a microphone so that we can hear you on the television broadcast. Joining us now, sitting right next to Ray, is M. William Phillips. He is one of the most sought-after serial killer experts in the United States, which is quite a title, I think. And he is the star of his hit show on the Discovery series called Dark Minds. He's also an investigative journalist and the national best-selling award-winning author of 23 books. And this may be my most favorite credential of Matt's, is he consulted on the first season of the hit Showtime cable TV series Dexter. So, if you haven't seen Dexter, it's about a cop who is actually a serial killer. And only in a dark mind like yours could that all come together. You probably have heard the name of Charlie Monagan. Charlie, for more than 2 decades, was the editor of Connecticut magazine. I didn't know that they were reading it in South Carolina in prison, but it's a testament to the reach of the magazine. Monaghan also, and I didn't know this until when I was just looking at your bio, Charlie, that you were administrative aide to Governor Bill O'Neill. So very interesting. At that time, Charlie was responsible for researching and writing all the governor's speeches during that period, as well as other work involving state issues and media relations. Charlie has published 8 books, including Connecticut Icons. And here's my favorite thing. He wrote the books and lyrics for a musical called Mad Bomber, which was produced in 2011 by the Seven Angels Theater in Waterbury, and as we hear, is being workshopped. So, let's get a little bit more into the Mad Bomber before I ask you why he inspired, of all things, a musical.
Okay, well, if you grew up in Waterbury in the 1950s, as I did, you had the Mad Bomber's story in your DNA. He was a character in the 1930s. He worked for Con Edison in New York. He was injured in a gas explosion, felt he was never properly compensated by Con Edison, which is probably accurate. He became, over the years, he became incensed, resentful, put his first pipe bomb on a windowsill at Con Edison headquarters in Lower Manhattan in 1941. He wrapped a note around it, which shows what an unskilled bomber he was. The bomb did go off, no harm. He tried a couple of others. For patriotic reasons, he took World War II off.
I think that was good of him, actually.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a villain, like, in like a cartoon movie. Like this isn't backstory. Yeah,
everything but the mustache. So he took the war off and then came back after the war, and especially in the early 1950s, stronger than ever, bigger bombs, more frequency. He put them in movie theaters. He would slice open a theater seat and put the bomb under there and leave. He put them in subway platforms. He put them at Macy's at Christmas time. Eventually, he was a terrorist. He became known. There were 7 daily newspapers at the time in New York, and he became known as the Mad Bomber. Eventually, after years, we move up to 1956, 57, one of the newspapers decides to open up a dialogue with him. They do open letter to the Mad Bomber on the front page. George, who is frustrated because no one knows why these bombs are being set off, or really he wants credit, as so many terrorists do. I mean, they don't like to be anonymous. He responded. And so they went back and forth, and finally he revealed enough so that a woman working at Con Edison recognized the handwriting in the letters that they reproduced from letters from a disgruntled former employee in her file, and pulled the file, and they came to Waterbury, where George lived with his 2 sisters, and they nabbed him finally. He was never put on trial for reasons of insanity. He went away for 19 years up the river, and someone who thought he was dying. He thought he had tuberculosis. He went to the sanitarium in Meriden for a while. No one ever found evidence that he had tuberculosis. He was convinced he did. Of course, he lived to be 91, and finally died peacefully in Waterbury. Became not a lovable figure exactly as the years went by. But he wasn't vilified. He sort of disappeared. He sort of went back into the seamy fabric of Waterbury, where nobody noticed him.
And the reason he would make a great subject for a musical?
Well, I thought there is no reason. I thought his story would be a good play, and I started putting the story together. And then it's like, I've seen musicals. I thought, why not make it a musical? Why not give it a shot? So I wrote the lyrics, had a very talented fellow named Richard DeRosa in Waterbury wrote the music, and we had a successful run in Waterbury, Mad Bomber, and now will be staged in Los Angeles later on this summer. So
that is great. That is really great.
One of them is about Waterbury. It's called The Paris of the Naugatuck Valley.
All right. Well, I'm sold. I'm sold on that. Let me get Matt into the picture here. Matt, years ago, I read your book about Amy Archer Gilligan, and I was fascinated because I think many of us probably have seen the movie or the play or a high school version of Arsenic and Old Lace. Has everybody seen it? And somehow it comes across as almost, kind of a comedy, sort of. It's dark, but
It's exactly what he did with the Mad Bomber.
It's kind of a comedy, but really, it really wasn't funny.
Well, it was the first time that America laughed at murder, really. You couldn't get away with it today. But no, Amy Archer opened she was definitely a jerk beyond being a serial killer. And one of the reasons was she opened what is basically the first convalescent home in America in Windsor. And her deal was, she had a bad business model, all right? Her deal was... That's the fact.
Okay.
Her deal was, she had 18 beds in the house. The house is still there, actually. And you move into the house and you pay her $1,000 for life care. So what happened was the beds quickly filled up and she had no turnover. So she had to what? Create her own turnover to make more money. So she starts knocking them off with arsenic. In the play, it's elderberry wine. Mm-hmm. But she just put it in anything she could, really. The food, lemonade, whatever she could. But, I mean, seriously speaking, she was one of the most prolific female serial killers that we've known in the United States.
Matt, why was she able to go on for so long, and why did it take so long for somebody to catch on to what she was doing?
Well, because there was no task force looking for serial killers at the time. There was no police in Windsor. The closest police was here in Hartford, and the state police, actually the Connecticut State Police, formed because of this case. They began because of this case. So the officers had to come from Hartford. In fact, an undercover officer did come from Hartford and moved into the home. Ultimately, that's how she got caught. But yeah, a definite jerk. The way she treated the people in the home, she didn't feed them, she didn't bathe them, she didn't change the sheets, she didn't do anything really. So she was definitely a jerk.
Ray, you didn't get a chance to talk about another woman that actually was a mass murderer, but she was intent on killing her whole family. That was Lydia Sherman.
Lydia Sherman, yeah, the Derby poisoner. I always figure, like, if you have, like, you pick up a name like that, it's never a good thing to start with.
If you become the Derby poisoner,
Derby poisoner, right? No one ever talks about going like Mother Teresa on someone. It's always like a Lizzie Borden. But yeah, she was in Derby. She started out in New York. Her husband was a police officer, and he had gotten fired from the force because of cowardice, or that was the accusation. He was moping around the house, and he was sad, and she felt bad, and she felt really bad, and someone suggested you should really put him out of their misery, and she was like, yeah, it's a good idea. So she gave him arsenic as, you know, it's one of the worst things you could give anybody in terms of poison. It is a slow-acting, horrible, agonizing death.
And it was easy to get at that time.
Oh, yeah, you could just walk into the store. That's one of the things I was thinking about when you talk about Amy Archer Gilligan being a jerk. She would have her victims go buy the poison for themselves, essentially. Yeah. They didn't know. They thought they were going to kill rats.
Well, arsenic was used then for bed bugs, too. You'd sprinkle it on the bed, etc. So, yeah, she would send a victim. And when she got really pissed off at somebody in the house, she would say, go get me some arsenic. And that was it for them. A couple of days later, they developed flu-like symptoms, and sometimes those symptoms would last.
You know, flu-like symptoms covers a lot.
It does.
Tastes like chicken.
Exactly.
Arsenic is tasteless, so it's easy to kill somebody with it because it acts quickly.
Wow. And so Lydia went on to not only kill her first husband, but a couple of others and a bunch of her children.
Yeah, after the first husband, she felt like she was all of a sudden this widow and she was stuck. Didn't think her, you know, as they say, didn't think her cunning plan all the way through.
Amy's a bigger jerk. She killed both of her husbands.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, she winds up killing 3, Lydia, but they're right, you know, the number,
a bigger jerk, then.
They're right up, you can argue the math on it. But like, yeah, Lydia, she felt bad for her kids because they were stuck, so she started offing them one at a time, and she wound up killing 6 of her own children.
Wow.
She had one older one that survived because he was old enough to move out on his own. And then she moved to Stratford. She became a nurse for someone, right? She married this guy who's referred to lovingly as Old Hurlbutt. He was 80-something. She was kind of an attractive woman. I mean, maybe that photo doesn't do her justice. But she married this older guy. He was in his 80s, and she started taking care of him, and he had a lot of money, and as she describes in her confession, she wrote a confession, it was kind of sensational. His hands started shaking. He wasn't feeling well. So she felt bad for him, so she thought she would just kind of speed the process along. And
Angel of Mercy.
Angel of Mercy, right. Yeah. So she killed him. Then she remarried again like 4 months later, killed her third husband and 2 of his kids, too, while she was at it, before someone finally said, something weird's going on here. Well, you got to remember, like, all the police departments, like you're saying, they weren't all connected. So, like, what she did in New York, they didn't realize that, you know, half her family died in New York. She conveniently moved away.
Serial murder, too, was not mass murder, serial murder. It was not something that police, law enforcement even thought about.
Right.
It just wasn't part of how we thought then, you know. And so you could get away with murder for a long, long time.
Apparently, yeah. Charlie, I'm going to talk about somebody that I heard about when I first moved to Connecticut. I think he was still alive at the time, and he was notorious. And this is the guy that Ray referred to as God, because he started referring to himself that way. And I think you covered him and met him, maybe. Interviewed him, Julius Shacknow?
I did. I was a 23-year-old reporter on the Meriden newspaper. And this felt, one night I was at a council meeting, covering the council meeting, and I heard 2 women behind me talking about children being drawn to something downtown. There was someone who rented a space, and so I turned around and asked them what they were talking about, and it turned out there was this self-described son of God who had opened up a publishing business in downtown Meriden and called himself Brother Julius. And he had an impressionable kid. He was having meetings every day, speaking to kids from Meriden. He had other kids from other places who had come and joined him. They were working at various places around town, mostly fast food type places, giving him the money from it. So I ended up, the fabulous story. I'm going to start working on it, and interviewed some of his followers, some of their parents, and finally the time came to interview him and go in and talk to him. And I talked to him for a while. The first thing he said to me was, the last person who wrote something negative about me got his leg broken in a car accident. And he was sort of a swarthy, pockmarked guy with a greasy beard. And he basically threatened me for the first 5 or 10 minutes of our interview. And did not strike me as the son of God. I mean, that was my personal take on it. And actually as a jerk, or a jerky son of God. I don't know, I didn't know exactly how to take it. But he got his followers, and I got a good 5-part story out of it for the local newspaper.
But not only was he eventually revealed, maybe in your stories, as this cult leader, if you will, but he had some fairly successful businesses for a while.
Well, he didn't. He had some assistants who were pretty good businessmen.
Construction business.
He was, real estate, construction. They called themselves a publishing company. Their published works were not too impressive. Mm-hmm. But he's the one who brought in the impressionable kids. And then you had a deprogrammer who came in named Ted Patrick, who was a famous deprogrammer at the time, and it was really quite a good story for a 23-year-old reporter, I'll tell you that.
And didn't they later reveal that he'd been sexually abusive to some of the young women that were in the group?
Yes, shocking. Definitely.
I mean, he had he was a jerk from beginning to end.
He was a jerk with a capital J, yes.
His own stepdaughters, too.
What's great about jerks is they don't themselves believe that they're jerks.
Right.
That's what
he thought he was the son of God. So,
the sinning Jesus, right? That was his thing. In order to know, sin, he had to partake himself.
That's right.
He believed that in order to understand sin, he had to commit sins himself.
Yes.
Exactly. And the younger the sin, the better.
Understood. Now, Matt, you wrote a really interesting book about somebody that a lot of us tend to think about in history as more of a hero, or at least a big figure in history, and particularly in changing the scene in Hartford, in developing industrial models, and that's Sam Colt. But you think he's a jerk.
Well, I don't want to sin in this building about Sam Colt, but jerk, his brother was definitely a jerk because his brother beheaded somebody in New York with a hatchet. And that's how I write about murder, so that's how I got interested in it. And one of the things I thought about when Sam spent just about everything he had defending his brother in New York. He bankrupts the first incarnation of Colt Manufacturing in New Jersey, defending his brother. And why? Why would he do that? Well, why would he do that? Well, his brother's girlfriend was pregnant with Sam's kid. So that would definitely make him a jerk. Again, that would definitely make him a jerk. He did do a lot of good for this city. He did do a lot of good for manufacturing. But I think, and we were talking earlier, I think I call them the bow tie police. And these are people who show up at signings when I do a history talk or something, and they're professors, and they're sitting in the front row, and, they're ready to attack. Because what I've done is I've tarnished that romantic image of their historical figure. I had a few when I wrote a book. I wrote a biography of Nathan Hale. I had a few of those come to my talks, the same thing, because I said Nathan Hale never said that famous last line. There's no proof of it. With Sam Colt, he had a rough life, but the one thing I made a point to say in my book was Sam Colt really didn't invent anything. He was not an inventor. Sam Colt, everybody's like, huh? I just give everybody a jaw. What? Huh? Does that make him a jerk? No, it makes him a smart businessman. Sam Colt was a marketer. He was a marketing genius. He also developed the manufacturing line. He also really developed that and was able to mass produce stuff. He did a lot of jerky things in order to make that happen. But no, he never invented anything. He took someone else's idea, he perfected it, and then he mass produced it and made a lot of money doing it.
Do people have questions? We'd be happy to entertain some questions. Just let's get the microphone over to you. Yes.
So current American society has kind of, in a sense, taken the whole concept of jerkiness to a whole new level with reality TV, Jersey Shore, Tosh.0, all that sort of thing. Was jerkiness celebrated throughout American history as it is today?
Interesting question. Who wants to take that on?
I would say no.
Yeah, I would say no. I think it was frowned upon for a long time. I mean, the society was a lot more proper. I mean, it still happened, definitely, but it wasn't celebrated like it is now. I mean, the closest you get to me is kind of some of the people like Barnum, where it was kind of like a wink and a nudge, kind of, like, oh, right, he's kind of lying to us a little, and it's kind of a jerk. Yeah, right, this way to the egress. But it wasn't really...
he was a state legislator in this building, right? Right upstairs.
Yeah, that's right. No, again, we're talking about him, so he'd be happy about it.
Yeah.
That's really his bottom line. His bottom line was the bottom line.
Yeah.
All he cared about was money.
I mean, nowadays, you just open up your iPhone, and there's plenty of jerks out there for you to run into. You write a book, you meet a lot of jerks, too, who email you and say things. You do a TV show, and that's 1,000 million times. Trust me. Trust me. I got jerks talking about my hair, from the highlights down to my shoes. Everything's wrong about me.
We kind of like it.
but I agree with Ray that jerkiness was not celebrated. It was, proper, prim and proper, I think.
Yeah. I think it's more recent type of.
I just want to add on to that comment. I think what we've sort of evolved into used to be, what will the neighbors say? Now we've evolved into, let's find out what the neighbors say, and it's out there.
Provoke the neighbors into saying something.
I think that's the model for all of these reality shows. I'm not a big fan, but you can't avoid them. But it's always like, let's find 7, 10, 12 of the worst people we can find, put them in a room, let the cameras run, and whatever happens, that's TV.
I'm around this type of thing, a production meeting. I hear what networks want because I'm involved in the TV world, and you'd be sick if I told you some of the things.
Oh, come on, just give us one little example.
Well, okay.
Boy, that was hard.
That was really like that.
There was a time when VH1, right? The producers who bought shows on VH1, when you pitched to them, if they didn't say what the F was that, they weren't considering it. So what that means is if they weren't saying, well, what the hell was that? Then it wasn't stupid enough or it wasn't jerky enough to go on the air. I mean, and now you look at that conveyor belt of stuff that's coming out on TV, and the South is big now. That's the big thing now on TV.
Swamps are big.
Swamps? Swamps.
Yep.
Swamps. And it's, TV is all about, as you know, TV is all about trends. It's all about what's working right now because they get those numbers every day.
Yeah.
When
everybody copies it.
That's my least favorite part of making my television series is when it airs because it's so nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
It's so. It all depends on how many people watch. It all depends on what people say. It's nerve-wracking. There's a lot of jerks out there in TV land.
I always think Charlie and I used to always talk.
And this is going on TV, right?
Yeah. We always talk about Idiocracy and how it's coming. If you've ever seen the movie Idiocracy and how it's coming true, and basically the premise being that we're just getting stupider and stupider and stupider as a society. And if you ever have a chance, I'm not going to say it's the greatest movie.
It's one of the hardest
movies to find. Yeah, it was made by Mike Judge, the guy who made King of the Hill, Beavis and Butthead, some other stuff. And yeah, it's really terrific. Apparently they cut his budget in the middle of the movie, so it kind of ends a little harshly.
A little suddenly?
No, you can see it. But the premise, I'm not telling you it's the greatest, it's not an Academy Award winner. But the premise behind it, when you start watching it, it's kind of horrifying because it seems so true. The idea basically that the smarter people are having less children and the not so smart people are having lots and lots and lots of children. Eventually they take over. The movie is, I don't want to ruin it for you, but it's...
You can't ruin it.
You can't ruin that. No.
And for some reason it's set way in the future.
It's like 500 years in the future.
And
it seems like
there's no reason for that.
It seems like it should be like 5 years in the future.
Smart television is hard to get on TV today. It's very hard.
But you have this program now to look for.
They want jerks. They want jerks on TV today.
Do we have some more questions from the audience? Anybody have some questions? They're all satisfied with just listening to the three of you riff on and on. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the guy that you said there is a slight possibility he could still be alive, and that's Salvatore Annunziato.
Right, Midge Renault. Yeah, he literally, when I write this in the book, he seemed to be the living embodiment of that Joe Pesci character from Goodfellas. You know, Tommy? I'm not great with the characters' names.
Tommy,
but
I think.
It was Tommy, yeah. But that kind of psychopathic, I mean, he constantly got in fights.
Hair-trigger temper,
just a bad guy through and through. But also would go around the neighborhood and give kids, $50 bills and just that kind of personality, and embraced it. Like he would tell people that, proud of being what he was, which was not a good guy necessarily. One of the little stories in there, I don't think I went into this too much detail. He had a mistress in addition to his wife, and
don't they all?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
I love his mistress. He bought the same furniture for both houses and had them put in the same place so he could find his way around both houses. So his mistress's house matched his wife's house. So
definite jerk.
Yeah. But I love that part of the story.
It's really stupid because you're going to get the two people who live there mixed up.
Well, I think his wife knew about his mistress and was just like, that's what it was. But he's a great story. Yeah, he's kind of fascinating. But yeah, he disappeared, and there was some speculation that he went to there's this, we kind of have this ill-placed love of the mafia and organized crime. It's murder. And it's crime, but people are romanticize it to an extent. Mm-hmm. I think some people think there is this old mobster's retirement home out west somewhere where they're all living quietly, and that's not what happens. These guys get murdered.
Bad guys.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Matt, what's the movie you're working on?
Movie? No, I'm working on a show. I'm working on the third season of my show right now.
Okay.
I'm doing...
Dark Minds.
Yep. Mm-hmm. I'm doing several cases. I'm doing one in Alaska, one in San Diego. I'm doing the Long Island case. That's very interesting. That has a Connecticut connection to one of the victims.
Tell us a little bit, just a fragment of that story.
Well, you have a girl goes missing, really, and she's an escort, and she goes missing in Long Island. So they begin to look for her in the marsh near Jones Beach. Mm-hmm. They don't find her, but they find 4 other girls buried in the sand in burlap bags. Mm-hmm. And then they begin to find hands and legs and heads and all kinds of stuff all over Long Island. And they don't find her. And then they find her in the marsh somewhere, and it appears that she wasn't one of the victims, that she had just kind of fell victim to being drugged up and fell into the water. What I do on my show is I have a jerk on my show every week. I have a serial killer in prison who I consult with every week, a real serial killer who he calls me all the time. Even when we're not doing the show, he calls me. And
did he send you letters too?
Yeah, he sends me hundreds of pages of letters every week. And he's definitely a jerk. He's killed a lot of people.
Goes beyond jerk.
Yeah, there's a certain level where it breaks off.
He's a psychopathic jerk. So, yeah, that's what I'm working on. That's my life. My life is built around serial killers, really. That's my life, yeah.
And I'm proud to know you. Nice to be friends with you. One last thing, and that is, does anybody have any nominees for Ray's Volume 2 of Speaking Ill of the Dead, Connecticut Jerks?
Come on, be honest.
Come on, be
Do they have to be dead? I guess they.
Like I get a lot of politicians. I don't have any politicians in the book because I felt like that's its own volume. Like Connecticut has got a lot. Unfortunately, has a very sad history, especially recently, of politicians gone wrong.
Yeah.
So that's like.
I think every state has that. I mean, it's chaos now.
It does seem that way. So I didn't have any in there, but people always throw names out like Phil Giordano, John Rowland. It's funny. A lot of people throw out the name Lowell Weicker. Not a fan of his. They're not fans of his, but I got to interview him recently, and I really liked him. I'm like, I know,
he's a smart guy.
He was smart. He was terrific.
Most jerks are smart.
Yeah, and that's part of the thing. The guy that I finished talking about, William Stewart, the counterfeiter. If you read through the book, like he just seems like you would want to sit down on a bar stool and just listen to him all night, tell stories. He'd buy him a couple of glasses of rum, and you would be good to go and entertained. And you wouldn't think he was a jerk. You just think he was great. Until he handed you some money and walked away, and you realized it was fake, and you'd be like,
yeah, I'll take care of this.
I got it. Yeah.
Well, one man's jerk is another man's statesman, I always say. Yeah. I want to thank all three of you for being with us today. It was really fun and a nice relief from a hot summer day. And their books are available, by the way, if you'd like to pick them up. You can do that and even get them signed. And thank you all for being here. Tell your friends to watch this on CTN. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.